Welcome. I'm George Bryan, and today I want to talk about 40 years of the Exchange Club's support of the prevention of child abuse in the United States. This has been a fantastic period of time, and a lot has occurred over these 40 years. So why me? Why talk about this? Well, I was the fourth director of an exchange center in the United States, beginning and founding a center in 1981. And from that time, I've helped or been a part of starting some 16 centers, whether they were satellites or freestanding. Over that time, I've also helped with the credentialing and the fidelity of the exchange programs in the United States. I've done some federally supported research on how well the Parent Aid program impacts families. And I continue to serve as the chair of the North Carolina Foundation for the Prevention of Child Abuse, as well as serve on national committees and chair the states of North Carolina's advisory board for community child protection and citizen review process. So I continue to have a lot of experience and history in working with the prevention programs that the Exchange Club has supported over the years. I'm also a member of the the Greater Winston-Salem Exchange Club in North Carolina, and have been a president of the district. So I want to talk a bit about the origins of the Parent Aid program and why this project was built on a foundation of success and research before the exchange clubs decided to embrace it in 1979. Now, first of all, what is a Parent Aid program? Now, we'll come back to some of the tenets of it later on in this educational broadcast, but a parent aide is a trained, professionally supervised individual, either volunteer or paid, who provides supported and educational in-home services to families at risk of child abuse and neglect. The services are strength-based and family-centered. So that's what the Exchange Club has been behind now for over 40 years. In 1979, Dr. Ed North, working out of Mississippi, who was very familiar with family medicine, proposed to the Exchange Club in a convention that we needed to have a national project that would make a difference in America, be central to the tenets of exchange, the big tenet being family, country, family, community, and that would really unite the different exchange clubs throughout the U.S. and Puerto Rico. So the National Exchange Convention embraced this, and I'll say more about this later. But let's also think about the times and child abuse back in the late 70s and in the 1980s. The United States, and the world for that matter, were not very aware of the issue of child abuse. One of the first books written on this expressed a concern that the children coming in that had broken bones and bruises and various ailments may have in fact been being injured by their parents. And in fact, we as pediatricians should be involved with the entire family, is what the book said. This now seems rather naive, as we know that this had been going on for centuries, for forever. But we were coming to grips with it in the United States. In the 1980, there were 625,100 children who were identified or whatever of being abused or neglected. By 1993, there were 1.8 million children that were being identified by the system. And then by 2020, there were 3.5 million investigated. So the child abuse had always been there. The increased education around what child abuse was And increased services that were able to deal with child abuse meant that there was a larger and larger identification. The problem was an overwhelming social issue as we began the 1980s in the United States. We're having all these children brought to the attention of pediatricians, of social service agencies, of counselors, meant that the system needed to respond with something that worked. Remember also at that time, the attitudes around hitting children were quite different than they are today. In a large retail market or something, you might see children regularly spanked as they were amongst the aisles. Schools largely still use corporal punishment. Even child care organizations use corporal punishments. Our attitude about hitting children and hitting within a family were quite different than what they are now. So when the issue of child abuse came around and the issue of supporting families, Dr. Ed North was ahead of his time in saying we need to look at these issues and be a part of the solution in the United States. The exchange clubs nationally did their research before deciding what kind of program to support. And we're going to talk today about the roots of the parent aid development in the United States and otherwise. And these are some of the names on this slide that became important to how a program arose that would really work with families and would make a difference. Shortly before 1979, when the Exchange Club embraced the parent aid model, there had been a study that had been federally supported called the Berkeley Study on the prevention of child abuse. It was published in December of 1977, and one of the primary authors was Ann Cohn. Ann Cohn became a very important person to the prevention movement in the United States. She later became executive of the National Committee for the Prevention of Child Abuse, which at the end of the 90s changed its name to Prevent Child Abuse. And she brought many programs and helped the United States grapple with education and identifying what child abuse and neglect was. She was really a leader in bringing the United States to grips with this problem of child abuse. But the Berkeley study was a federal study that was trying to say, okay, what works in the prevention of child abuse and in the treatment of child abuse? And there were 11 demonstration projects. A demonstration project is one that's been supported in order to prove what kind of effect it might have. One that was listed there was SCAN, Stop Child Abuse Now, or Suspected Child Abuse and Neglect, as it was originally called. It was a lay therapy program. It was one of the most successful in the entire study, if not the most successful one in there. And what was also exciting about this particular program versus the others was it could engage the community along with working with professionals, and it had this home visiting component. So Ed North was looking for something that would make a big difference, and in 1977, this was what the federal government and all the studies were saying was this may be an answer to dealing with child abuse and neglect. This lay therapy program, SCAN, Suspected Child Abuse and Neglect, did not come out of nothing. There were a lot of influences that fed the program design and helped the program understand why it worked, even if they didn't know about some of these other models that were being developed at a parallel time in history. One of the big names in child abuse at the end of the 70s was Dr. Henry Kemp. And he and his wife were both doctors that worked in Denver with child abuse and neglect. And he was one of the authors of the 1962 book, which was The Battered Child Syndrome. And back then, as I say, people were just discovering the magnitude of the problem of child abuse, and Dr. Kemp was one of those that was pointing that it was a huge social problem. So the Kemps, on a visit to England, discovered a grandparenting program. And what happened in England was when a family needed the kind of support that we're talking about here, they would match them with a volunteer, a grandparent-like relationship where that person would resource the family and help them deal with all the social ins and outs that may have led to abusing or neglecting a child. They brought that program back over to Denver to their clinic, the Kemp Center. And this home visiting, which was grandparents visiting somebody in their home, became one of the core roots to the home visiting methodology in the United States. There were some other cores and origins of home visiting, though, and I really have to trace this back to one Dr. Josephine Baker, and she was the first woman head of public health in New York City. She worked in Hell's Kitchen, which is an area of New York that I used to live in for a period of time, a very poor part of New York City. It was an immigrant community. The Bowery was in that area. She came into the public health in New York and saw the ailments that children were having in the immigrant community and wondered how they could help them. So she took the public health nurses out of the clinics and said, go into the homes. And what she discovered was there were a lot of babies that were being born who became blind. She instituted using silver nitrate during the birthing process, and she decreased in 1 year the number of infants that were born blind from 300 to 3. In the same period of time, she was able to track that doing these home visits, that explaining to families about milk, about breastfeeding, about nutrition and cleanliness, saved 1,200 infant fatalities in that year. So it was a radical change to delivering services, moving from the clinics to in the home. And the difference was major. Another big influencer in all of this was Dr. David Olds. And in 1977, in an upstate New York town of Elmira, New York, Dr. Olds ran an experimental program, had a control group and a serviced group. And these were teen moms, young teen moms that were giving birth. And he followed the outcomes of these teen moms to see what kind of effect this home visiting had on them. And what he discovered amongst the better use of medical care, more vaccinations, more jobs and things like that these teen moms had, was that there was a big difference in the number of these babies that were born within that control group in terms of being identified as abused and neglected versus the general population. So David Olds' program, now known as the Nurse Home Visitation Program, began here. It was replicated in a couple of different other places. It was researched several times, but after the success at Elmira in 1977, other areas began doing this type of program. But it did require professionally trained nurses to provide the service, so it was a fairly costly program in impacting child abuse and neglect. In the United States at that time, the biggest program, I would say, in terms of dealing with child abuse and neglect was what was called Parents Anonymous. And Parents Anonymous was a totally voluntary program where it had been designed and developed by a person who had been involved as a abuser or neglector of her children, and had decided that she could help others and share with them so that folks didn't have to get stuck in this pattern. So Parents Anonymous was federally supported, was in just about every community across the United States as a way to deal with parents that were involved in child abuse and neglect. So all of these influences were either happening parallel or directly influenced what happened in Arkansas to develop suspected child abuse and neglect, or SCAN. The Exchange Club went there and contracted with SCAN of Arkansas to help them develop programs throughout the United States. But the story of why this particular method of home visiting was important and had developed so well really came down to the person of Sharon Pallone, who was a well-to-do woman who lived in the Little Rock, Arkansas area, and told her story about how she started this program. In 1982, I was part of the first symposium which occurred of the exchange supported centers in the United States. And we went to Little Rock. We were trained in parenting techniques, but we heard the story directly from Sharon Pallone of how this developed. And it turns out that she went to a drugstore one day, and the drugstore had a lunch counter in it. And while she was in there, she saw a mother who was sniffling and a baby who had a runny nose, and they were obviously a little bit ill. They were looking for some over-counter medication. She helped to get that for them and set them down at the lunch counter and fed them a meal and talked to them a little bit, and then felt good about herself. She had done a good deed that day. She'd help a mom and their baby out, and that was wonderful. You know, we've helped the world a little bit as we do these little bits of kindness. It was shortly after that she was contacted by authorities and said, "Do you know this mother? We understand you were with her in this drugstore, and she is alleged to have abused or neglected her child. So if you could identify her, we'd appreciate it." Well, she didn't, but the mother was later identified and began working in counseling with a psychologist in Little Rock. And the psychologist who worked with other parents who were involved in child abuse and neglect noticed that the prognosis of this mother was much better, that it seemed like she was going to succeed in counseling at a much faster pace than many of his clients who tended to recidivate in their progress. So he explored why what was the difference? Why was she making so much progress? And discovered it was a relationship with Sharon Pallone that was really helping her and was a resource to us. And this mother felt like she could pick up the telephone, no cell then, and call Sharon and get support. And Sharon would help her not only around the baby, but around where she was living, getting furniture, getting resources, finding jobs, education, things like that. So the psychologist asked Sharon to maybe work with a few more of his families, and also to find some friends that might work with him. And so initially, this whole effort began out of the back of her car, in the trunk of her car, and then quickly jumped to an office. And from that point, with all of Sharon and her family's connections in Arkansas, it began being supported by the state as a very successful program, and of course got a big boost in that 70s study that proved it was one of the best programs, or the most impactful programs in the United States in child abuse and neglect. And the state soon began contracting with suspected child abuse and neglect as the child abuse service in 13 of the counties in Arkansas. That means that they would do the investigations, the follow up, the treatment, the work in front of the court. All of that was done by SCAN of Arkansas. So it became an important part and a lot of experience in what was happening. Initially, this program, as I said, was contracted by the National Exchange. It didn't take many years before National Exchange hired a couple of their staff to come and work at the national office in Toledo and brought the administration of this growing network of child abuse prevention centers within the confines of the national office. While SCAN of Arkansas was developing, there were other factors coming together, and some of us that were part of this early development brought our own skills and own knowledge of the subject to bear. In the early days, in that first year or so, there were 5 centers begun. I mentioned I was the founding director of the 4th center, the one in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And the expertise of the people that came in with these new centers helped to develop ideas throughout the network. We were very closely supervised at that time by the national office. Each week we would talk about new cases, disposition of the cases, challenges we might be having with particular cases that were going on. But very shortly afterwards, that became a huge task, and centers were expected to do their own quality control. That early supervision ensured fidelity to the model and ensured that the training of all the staff was done by the national office, and the weekly supervision was able to keep an eye on whether that quality was being kept up. I mean, the issue of child abuse and neglect, when you're talking about the potential of a child being killed or injured for life and parents going to court and being in jail, it was very weighty, and it needed to be done right. And you had to worry about liability issues as well as the quality issues that were important at that time. In 1983, there was a National Child Abuse and Neglect Conference in Baltimore. These conferences had just begun as a way to support child abuse prevention and treatment efforts in the United States. In fact, that was really the only source. Schools were not providing information on child abuse in their social work programs. There was very few places you could go to learn how to deal with child abuse. Most of it was being shared in conferences by people who had developed their own expertise and were willing to share it. On a bulletin board there, I went to that conference, and on the cork board there was a little notice that said we would like to convene a small working group of folks that were doing home visiting to figure out how we might support each other in this work. And I went to that group, and my eyes were wide open in terms of what was going on in the Northeast of the United States. Massachusetts and Connecticut already had big networks of home visitors, and they were called parent aides up there versus lay therapists where I was, and the Arkansas and National Exchange model. So these home visitors in the Northeast were getting state support, which was quite a progression over what we were seeing, where we were scrambling for funding to try to provide these services in a variety of states. Very shortly after that, I believe it was in '84, there was an AARP study that was supported by the federal government. That's the American Association of Retired People. And they hired a woman out of the Judge Baker Clinic in Boston, Massachusetts, to conduct this study. And the goal of the study was to see if senior Americans matched with families that were involved in child abuse and neglect could make an impact, whether it be any difference. And there was a control group and an experimental group, and there were resources, and AARP came to Winston-Salem and to other places. There were 5 sites in the United States, and they trained us in dealing with seniors, and how to change our trainings, how to adapt. We developed across those 5 centers some improvements in supervision and documentation that would help in running the programs. At the end of the study, the AARP found that the families that were served with seniors tended to do better than other families that were served by other people, and it really made a difference. A secondary part of that study, though, was to develop a directory of home visiting programs in the United States. So from the very beginning, I was involved in developing that, and remembering that in 1982, we got our first IBM desktop computer. They were just coming out. I was able to use some of the software to help pull a directory of centers together. And as we collected this over the next sort of 5 years, we came up with over 800, almost 900 centers in the United States that were using some form of home visiting, and it was growing very rapidly within that decade. The other thing that came out of these two efforts were state conferences. We noticed that there were state conferences that were just beginning in the Northeast, and we began to pull together as a national group regional conferences. We formed a national organization called the National Parent Aide Association, and the National Parent Aide Association pulled these regional and state conferences together. We looked at the directory. We began to credential parent aides, because volunteer parent aides had a variety of trainings, and we felt like there were some essential parts that needed to happen before you began to work with a family. We worked on a strength-based model in the midst of that. All of this was parallel with what we were doing with the National Exchange and what I was doing with that. I eventually became chair of the National Parent Aide Association as we began to expand this in the United States. So there was a lot of energy going into home visits. The federal government was taking quite a bit of interest in what was going on to try to find a solution to this gigantic problem. Remember, it was growing, growing, growing. Each year we would see the statistics go up as the federal government would collect these data from all the different states. The United States has set up an advisory committee on child abuse and neglect, the U.S. Advisory Committee, and the U.S. Advisory Committee began to look at the data. They began to take testimony on what worked and what didn't work, and try to figure out how can we focus the efforts of the United States. The efforts of the U.S. Advisory Committee helped create several publications which were a big part of educating the community. Remember, a huge part of what was going on at this time was educating people, parents, the public, businesses, the governments. What is child abuse and neglect? How do you know what it is when you see them? There were many, many trainings on this, and this in itself was beginning to impact the children and the safety of the children. At the 9th National Conference on Child Abuse and Neglect, NCAN Conference, in 1991, it occurred in Denver. And I was there with this conference representing the National Parent Aide Association and my efforts with the Exchange Club Center. And it was a Denver proclamation. And what the U.S. Advisory Committee said in a well-televised press conference as we stood there at the conference was that the efforts of the United States should really go into home visiting, that home visiting tended to make the biggest difference in supporting families. Again, Dr. Ed North, the National Exchange Club, was in a leadership role in the United States, having already embraced this model over a decade before. Very shortly after 1991, the National Committee on the Prevention of Child Abuse, whose national office was in Chicago, awarded the first National Home Visiting Awards. I was there to be recipient of this first award on behalf of the National Exchange and the work that we were doing with the parent aid programs in the United States. We were still using the term lay therapy, but some of our centers were beginning to migrate to different home visiting names. And very shortly after that, we changed the name of lay therapy to parent aides. Home visiting programs were maturing, and they were known by a variety of names. In the some 800 to 900 programs that I was keeping on my computer of the national directory, there were things like parent educator, home visitor, lay therapist, nurse visitor, grandparent. There were a number of names that were being used. It wasn't a very consolidated field, but the National Parent Aid Association was helping to focus it. It wasn't many years later that the National Exchange Club actually took over co-sponsoring the National Parent Aid Association, and it was turned into the National Parent Aid Network. And the offices of that were moved to be co-located in Toledo with the National Exchange Club. But during this period of time, we had programs like this, like you're seeing on this slide. And there was a big change getting ready to happen with home visits. I think it was 1991. And some of us were invited to go to Hawaii and take a look at a program called Healthy Start. And we went to Hawaii, and the founders of that program sat down with a group of about 100 people and explained to them how the home visiting in Hawaii and the model of training and maintaining the program was making such a difference in child abuse and neglect. The legislature in Hawaii had embraced the model and was expanding it throughout the islands to be sure that every family had access to this when they had a baby. Ann Cohn, as you can see in the slide, was there. And that next year, 1992, the National Committee for the Prevention of Child Abuse, which is now known as Prevent Child Abuse America, pulled that program to the mainland, got the support of the Ronald McDonald Fund, and began to develop Healthy Families program, which now has spread across the United States as well. The intersection of that was really through many of our centers and through home visiting. At that time, actually, we were co-located with the National Parent Aid Association in the offices of Prevent Child Abuse in Chicago. But the additional thing was that many of the centers, the exchange centers in the United States, were the state office for Prevent Child Abuse in that particular state. And so there was a lot of influence back and forth in terms of how this program was going to develop and what was happening in terms of home visiting. So the initial 5 programs with the National Exchange were Jackson, Tennessee, Fort Pierce, Florida, Rockville, Connecticut, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where I was the founding director, and Jackson, Mississippi. At that time, National Exchange sponsored each center with an initial $25,000 in support, but the other support, just like today, needed to be raised locally, as well as a local board and a variety of local agreements with the Department of Social Services or Child Welfare in that particular area. There was a tremendous growth of professionalism during this period of time. We adopted the credentialing that had been done by the National Parent Aid Association for parent aides, but we were now competing with Healthy Families and some other parent aid programs and needed to do more around the area of fidelity, that is, keeping the program model to its roots. And we needed to do more to be sure that the outcomes that we were getting were coming from a quality program. And in that area, we began to develop the national credentialing for programs, which is now done about every 5 years with a center. And it goes through all the documentation and information from boards and community partners to prove that that center is using the model in the way it should be used, that it has fidelity, that it has the infrastructure in place, the quality of supervision, the follow-up with notes, the different administrative factors that keep a good nonprofit solid, and all the aspects there were part of that credentialing piece. We really drove that from our Winston-Salem Center, inviting national folks and other center directors to come to Winston-Salem, and we sat down and we built that framework for that credentialing out of the work that directors were doing in a variety of centers in the United States. National office then took that, developed that into the credentialing pattern, and it has always since that time been resourced by the directors that are doing the work on the front line. Did all this make an impact? Was anything changing? You know, so many times with social issues, feels like you're just going round and round in circles. You're never making progress. You're never able to prove that what you're doing has made a difference. This graph that I pulled up here, somewhat arbitrarily between 1990 to 2017, shows the incidences of sexual abuse, the incidences of physical abuse, and of neglect, the top line being neglect, and how it changed from year to year. And part of it had to do with different ways of reporting, different definitions that went on, but there definitely was a change from that period of time. What we need to celebrate as exchange members and as exchange centers in the United States is that during this period of time when we developed and we were a major partner in helping to treat and educate about child abuse and neglect, 52% decrease in physical abuse of children, a 62.8%, almost 63% decrease in sexual abuse of children. And you say, well, you know, statistics are a little difficult to put together. These have been looked at from different angles, and there was a major impact on working with families that made a difference. And exchange and the forethought and the leadership that occurred in 1979 was a partner in making a major difference in families, of bringing hope and respect to families around the issue of child abuse as they dealt with a big struggle in their homes. In this whole field of child abuse and neglect, we were all being pushed to prove which model of home visiting made an impact with families. There is, as mentioned, numerous models that were out there. I believe it was in 2013, I wrote a grant to the federal government and received a grant to study in a scientific format the impact of the exchange parent aid program on families. And so I took 5 centers, which I was the executive director of in North Carolina. They include urban and rural, a variety of cultures within those service of those centers. And we held constant our service for a period of about 3 or 4 years. And we had a control group that was provided just resources, not parent aids. And we measured the impacts that parent aids had against the impacts of just providing telephone support and resources that the family may have wanted to get involved with. As you might imagine, that was a very difficult task for the centers to do, and of course they wanted to do more for the families that were in the control group. Dr. Neil Guterman, who had written a book on child maltreatment and evaluation, led the research group out of initially the University at Columbia, the School of Social Work there, and then he took over as dean at the University of Chicago Social Work, and when the study was being finished. And these are the results that we ended up with that were statistically significant. There was a reduced maternal stress, maternal depression, and maternal anxiety. Now, this is tremendously important in the exchange model. If you reduce stress, you reduce numerous other issues that are going on with a family, with partners, with jobs, but most importantly, in the relationship with one's children and what that might mean in terms of how you handle their behaviors, inspire them to growth and development. There was a statistical significance of increased parental mastery. Now, we were giving each of these families a battery of 11 tests over a period of time. And so this showed that the parents were learning what parent education was all about, what the difference was in how you do this. And they felt better about parenting. And then lastly, with statistical impact was the reduced psychological aggression and physical assault toward the child. So we were showing with these families that there was less physical abuse. There was less psychological aggression that occurred using this National Parent Aid Exchange model. Now, the other side of the slide shows there was a mild to negligible positively, it wasn't a statistically significant, but there was a trend in terms of less maternal hostility, less male partner drug use. There was a mild positive trend on protective factors, particularly father involvement when we got these parent aides involved at the family level. And there was a trend on self-reporting indicators about their physical abuse and neglect, of what might be in the field considered abuse and neglect. When they would report talking about it, those trends were headed down when what we were doing. The only one we were unable to impact was the neglect one on the household adequacy, even though our data that we were talking about on a day-to-day basis was we were helping the families become better educated, better housed, better jobs. And we had done an earlier study on this in North Carolina, which showed that that was very true with all the families that we had. We had a very strong trend to helping them in these social aspects of their lives. What this study enabled us to do was to go back out to our funding sources, go back out to our states and said, we are evidence-based service. We can prove that we work. With the work of the National Exchange Office, we became certified. This study was written up and then published internationally in the International Journal of Child Abuse and Neglect, and can be accessed over the web if you want to look at more details on how the exchange parent aid model impacts families. The national office took this data and had it certified by the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse, or CEBC. The CEBC ranks us as a promising research evidence program. What this does is provides this outside credential that enables each of our programs in the United States that are using the model and being truthful to the model that is the exchange parent aid model, that it is producing similar results. And this evidence base gives them access to their funders. In some states, it's providing access to state funds to provide a home-based home visiting program to families involved in child abuse and neglect. It has provided a great pathway to promoting the exchange parent aid program in the United States. So now there are over 60 programs across the United States. We literally go coast to coast with exchange programs now. There are areas where we are more concentrated, like in the Southeast, like in California, like in the Midwest. But these programs are affecting now almost 2 million children in the United States over the period of their establishment. The Exchange Club is making a tremendous difference in helping communities and families in our nation in strengthening this effort through the work of the Parent Aid programs. The national office is always there to help new programs get started in the United States. Some of the services that they provide in support of this prevention effort are the National Exchange Club's annual symposium for the prevention of child abuse, where the center directors from across the United States come together and are able to talk to one another and learn different methods of working with their centers and with families to make a bigger difference. There's a Parent Aid training manual which provides a consistency of services and a fidelity to model across programs. The national office also helps new areas with development and helps current areas with expansion of services, as we have seen. The accreditation process is handled by the national office, and that's an extensive, detailed job to accredit centers and be sure they're providing the quality services that we should as the national exchange centers. There's the certification of the parent aides that are going out and doing the day-to-day work with the families. Some of these are still volunteers, while most of them are now paid positions. The national office also works on Child Abuse Prevention Month activities and has come up with calendars each year to help focus during the month of April the efforts of centers around the United States on the issue of child abuse and help communities grapple with that issue. And tip cards, lastly, things like Timeout Teddy, prevention, tip cards about parent education and how you can work with the behavior of your children, how you can build their self-esteem. These are all wonderful things that your National Exchange Office in Toledo provides for centers throughout the United States. Exchange should be very proud. We have made a huge impact on millions of people, and we have brought hope and respect and a future for many children. Thank you for the work you've done out there.